Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my worm array and I'm giving this weird perspective just to show you something I made reference to a couple times, which is this pumpkin from last Halloween. I mean, mind you, we're in the middle of October now, so almost a year that pumpkin has been around. I'm sure it was probably harvested about a year ago and then sold, and then it was put out as a Halloween decoration last year. So it's amazing that it's still holding up. I check it once in a while just to see if it's still holding together. No soft spots, no tender areas, but I just thought I'd share it with you because at one point soon I'm assuming we're probably going to have to make worm food out of it. Here's my shredders. But we're not here to talk about pumpkins or shredders. We're here to feed worms. And the worms that are going to get fed today are my original red wigglers. They live in these two stacked containers over here. So we're going to slip on a glove, get these little guys up onto the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. So here we have what they're getting today, and as you can see, it's stacked pretty high. It's almost overflowing and almost obscured entirely by all the yummy kitchen scraps. All the veggies and whatever that's in here are a couple days worth of coffee, including the coffee filters. So they're going to be getting a pretty generous feeding. Sometimes I come down here with my little green information board that has stats about these systems written on it so that I could share it with you, but sometimes I try to come up with like a little way of remembering the information without having to write it down and bring it down here for myself. And today I think I've got a pretty good way of doing that, which covers pretty much all the bases. So it's all about the numbers 12, 13, and 14. So it's 12 days since we last checked in on these little guys. 13 is the 13th feeding that they're getting fed today. And the 14 is really just part of the age of the bins, which is 140 days of age. That's 20 weeks. Pretty simple math over there, right? So let's get the camera pointed down at the bins and let's get to feeding these little guys. Since we've got coffee filters, new ones, we can swap these out with replacements, and these old ones can go in as supplementary bedding when we reset their feeding zones, if we don't forget. So I'll try to position them in a way that they're kind of within view. Things are stacking up really nice over here. Last time when we came in here, there was a piece of leftover top covering, newspaper, there was a whole bunch of these leaves scattered about, and all that stuff kind of got blended in, and then back went the feeding zone indicators, but no form of top covering, which I kind of like to do sometimes. So I've got a couple replacement newspaper top coverings that we could position out here at the end when we're done feeding. So why don't we get to taking care of these little guys and get them fed. I'm pretty sure that the stuff they got 12 days ago is gonna be gone by now, because it was all stuff that I figured they would eat 1, 2, 3. Well, not all gone, right? Because like here is evidence of the last feeding from 12 days ago, but it's the sort of leftovers that you definitely would anticipate finding. It's the skin of the cantaloupe melon. So there was, here again, easy to remember, all letter C's, right? There was cucumber peels, cantaloupe melon skins or rinds, and coffee, as well as maybe a few other things, but those were the primary elements that we used to feed last time. And after 12 days, you would have to expect that the majority of that stuff, perhaps with the exception of the kind of tough skins of the cantaloupe rinds, would be gone by now. And I guess here, once in a while, I bump into a piece of like napkin or paper towel or something like that, which appears to have sort of gotten crumbled up into a little lump, so that would prevent it from getting broken down very easily. So I see what I could do about tearing it apart and shredding it into somewhat smaller pieces, making it easier for the worms to approach it from all angles and hopefully break it down for us a little quicker that way. And usually there's other things in here that you try to identify, but they're so far gone that it's kind of a crapshoot as to whether or not you're correct. But I don't know. If you've been doing it for a while, you start to recognize things. I believe that this might be a banana peel, or what's left of it. And then I already found another piece earlier, but this is another of it. A piece of corn cob. There is sort of a distinct shape to it. You can kind of feel its shape. And my new thing with corn cobs these days has been to not worry so much about being able to identify it the next time. Just maybe help it along by breaking it into smaller pieces as well, kind of like I did with the napkin before, or paper towel, or whatever that thing was. So that's kind of my new thing with corn cobs these days. But I think we've kind of excavated the feeding zone from last time for the most part pretty good over here in bin number 2. I was looking at my spreadsheet earlier because I know that these two bins do qualify as what I would consider to be twin bins because of their populations being thought to be the same. And you know, that's one number I did not jot down or use some sort of a method to remember. But we did at some point come to the point where, yeah. We came to the point at some point recently where the populations of these systems were pretty close, and then I assume we might have hauled a couple worms over from the more populous bin into the less populous bin to even out their numbers. Or maybe we were all just agreed that there was an identical number of worms when we originally launched these systems and estimated their worm counts. I don't recall how we arrived at the worm population counts exactly, but there's these two systems as well as my my African night crawlers, the African night crawlers that I got from Gaetano over at Northeast Worms. And I've got other African night crawlers that I received from Emily, the crazy worm lady, all those years ago, but those worms live in yellow buckets right now. And I don't think that I don't know if we've got estimates for the number of worms that live in those buckets. I can't remember what the deal was over there, but according to my spreadsheet, there were only 2 pairs of bins where we were treating them as what I consider to be twin bins because of the equal population size. And I usually also consider systems as twin bins when they're bins that had been launched on the same day, meaning that they're the same age. So those are kind of the basic criteria for considering bins as twins. Otherwise, I might just consider them as brothers or sisters if they're bins that were launched on the same day but are not thought to have the same population size. And if it's just a couple of bins that I paired up without those other qualifications being in place, then I'll just treat those as buddy bins. So that's my basic nomenclature when you hear me using it. So we've excavated both feeding areas, and I think we're ready to become really generous with the feeding today, because I've got my prepared bedding here. Something about these bins tells me that the level's perhaps a little bit lower than it could be. So I thought we would like really stack the food high, and then in order to get the feeding zone thoroughly covered, we would till up the outer edges of the systems and bring in some of the material from the outside to make sure we're covered up. And by tilling things up, it'll sort of fluff the whole the whole contents will be all fluffed up, a little bit more airy throughout, kind of forcing it to occupy more space, more volume. So I think that'll just by its nature bring the level of both of these bins up a bit. And there's certainly room in here to do that. So I figured, why not? Let's be super generous with the bedding today, but it seems kind of boring, just a big wad of somewhat fresh bedding sitting down here. So one of the things I've been feeding to a lot of my systems, and I thought it might be a good idea to plop some of that down into this bedding here today, is this pulverized corn cob flakes that I've got. So I had a whole bunch of corn cob, and that included the kernels on the cobs, which I ran through my little personal blender, my magic bullet, turning it all into this really nice fine consistency. I've been and it's not totally dry either. It's got some moisture content. It's for that reason I've been keeping it in my refrigerator so that it doesn't become moldy. Because even though it's been a couple weeks now since I prepared this stuff, and I had, besides this fairly large size jar, I had a somewhat smaller size jar. They were both full of this stuff. And I've been gradually doing away with it, including it in almost all my feedings when I remember to bring it with me. But I want to do away with this batch because I've got more. I got a few more corn cobs that have just been sort of sitting around, drying. Not that it needs to be terribly dry, I think, because it seemed to work out well by not being completely dried. So I'd like to get around to grinding all that stuff up and preparing some more of this at some point soon, but I'm kind of treating the presence of this stuff as leftovers as needing to be gone before I can proceed to doing that. So let's see here. We've got a nice platform onto which we can prepare today's meal. Just drop in all this chunks of all kinds of stuff. There's like the leaves of cauliflower here, all chopped into little tiny bits to make it easy to handle in my worm feedings. There's carrot, celery, all kinds of stuff that would have been used in a soup, I believe. Here's some chunks of tomato, and even some little cherry tomatoes from my garden that weren't looking too good, so they're worm food too now. Let's keep on piling it in. And somehow, just based on its weight, I felt like we had a lot of food to give them today. But it really doesn't seem like such a huge, impressive feeding once it's all down here in the feeding area. Either way, I think we should just get this stuff in here so we can get to the fun part, which is tilling up the outer edges of the bin, where we get to see a whole lot more worms when we get around to covering up the feeding zones. And here I've got a soiled paper towel, which can also be dropped into these systems as supplementary bedding. I think the worms are going to appreciate this. Nice generous application of bedding, a nice assortment of delicious foods for them. The stuff I'm sprinkling in here is crushed eggshell, which is the grit that I use in my systems. Grit is helpful to worms because they'll ingest it with the foods that they're eating, and then that helps them digest the foods that they've eaten. So I just reminded myself of the leftovers we excavated. So before we drop the coffee in and sprinkle worm chow on it, let's make sure we get these leftover bits back into the feeding area as well. Little bits of cantaloupe rind, little bits of banana peel, little scraps of napkin or paper or whatever that was. And as you can see, we've pretty much already matched the level of the surrounding material prior to it being tilled up. All this stuff is what I excavated. The level's going to be a little bit higher now, I think, as a result of this feeding. Here's the worm chow. Let's plop in the coffee, onto which we can sprinkle the worm chow. And I think that's just a way of increasing the appeal of the coffee to make the worms even have a greater appreciation for it. Have even a greater appreciation for it. How does that sound? And you know, I'm glad that there's plenty of room in these systems on the edges for the worms to retreat to, just in case this feeding heats up, because all this food, once the bacteria and the microbes and everything that occupy this bin start to work on this stuff and get the decomposition of this stuff underway, there is the potential of the feeding zone warming up, and perhaps even to the point where it gets so hot that the worms just can't even really tolerate it. So I'm always glad that there's sufficient space for the worms to be able to move away and get away from this stuff until such a time that it has kind of gotten past that heating up phase and can then be approached by the worms. And that's something I've never really paid much attention to, but there are other worm channels out there, like the Learn by Doing channel. They've got actual thermometers down in their systems that they track the progress of, so they can actually see without even opening the system up to see if there's a change in the temperatures down there. And sometimes it's kind of interesting when you hear about how hot the feeding zone of a worm bin gets. Something I somehow completely never, there again, how do I form that sentence to make sense? Completely what? I pretty much completely ignore my bins after I've fed them for whatever reason. I just don't bother to come back in to see how they're doing. I mean, that's not a rule, it's just kind of the basic way I do things here. I set them up with their food and then I cover them up, and usually it's, a week, 10 days, maybe longer before we return to the systems to see how things are. And what happens between those 2 points in time is anyone's guess. I mean, sometimes there's little signs of what might have happened, but I don't really come back in to, for example, see if there's a temperature change or if I can sense warmth over where the feeding zone is. I just kind of assume that it could be happening, and as long as I've set things up in such a way that it gives the worms a place to retreat from it and not be harmed by it, then I think we're okay, I think that's just fine. So I think despite my efforts to get things level over here, I've still got, I don't know if it's visible on the camera, but there is definitely a mound over here, sort of a higher elevation over in this section of the bin, where we added a whole lot of bedding and a whole bunch of food and goodies for the worms. So whether we got to come back here in 12 days again like we did this time to feed them, or if we can wait a little bit longer, we can either go one way or the other. It wouldn't matter so much. I mean, the types of foods that we just placed in here do seem like the sort of things that they might do away with pretty quickly. All those juicy vegetable bits that had been frozen, as they thaw, they're going to get mushy and easy to eat. Tomato bits, they're all juicy and mostly water. So I think even if we did come back in here in 12 days or so, we could easily add more kitchen scraps. If we were to wait even longer, who knows, if we even waited twice that much time, it would still be fine too, because even if the kitchen scraps all ran out, they could just turn to all that lovely bedding we added, and they could just feast on that until they get more kitchen scraps. So either way, it always feels kind of good once you've completed a fairly generous feeding that includes a good amount of bedding, because you know that it gives you a little bit of cushion, on having to come back soon and tend to their needs. It's just sort of reassuring to know that should, life become busy and the ability to return to the bins sometime soon is, interfered with because of other more important matters, then it's kind of nice to know that the worms are going to be just fine. So that's it for our check-in with the original Red Wiggler worms. Doing really nice in here, I must say. I'm very pleased to see how things look, and it's kind of cool to see how the level of both systems has risen here a little bit. Perhaps we can do something similar next time and continue with the boost to the bedding theme here, because there's definitely space for it. Alright, I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.